A good survey or poll is one that has the least errors and the most randomness. However, it is nearly impossible to omit all error from a survey, and thus we have to account for it by calculating a margin of error. Margin of error in statistics is basically a standard deviation percentage of a particular parameter that takes into consideration certain sampling errors. A sampling error is just the variability from sample to sample. This isn't a real survey, but say for example that 50% of Americans like McDonald's. In your first sample though, 49% like McDonald's, and in your second sample, 51% like McDonald's. This is sampling variability. Random sampling errors like this are the reason for having a margin of error. If we did the survey 100 more times with different samples, the margin of error is what makes the range more inclusive of all statistics from different samples. This article comes from Gallup.com and is titled, "Americans' Desire to Shed Pounds Outweighs Efforts." It measures Americans' ideal weights and whether they are under, at, or over their ideal weight. The article states nearly 6 in 10 Americans are heavier than their ideal weight by at least 1 pound, while fewer than 2 in 10 are at their ideal weight. This suggests that adults are much more likely to know that they are heavier than their ideal weight than to classify themselves as overweight. So essentially, as you can see on the table, the results show that 59% of Americans are over their ideal weight, 18% are at their ideal weight, and 15% are under their ideal weight. To calculate the margin of error for the total Americans at each level, disregarding men and women separately, we need to use the formula that uses confidence intervals. The top equation below is the general formula to calculate the margin of error. N in the equation is the sample, or the participants, which in this case was 1,039 Americans. Technically, there were 562 men and 477 women, but for our purposes we're only going to calculate the margin of error for total Americans. The Z-star number is the number that corresponds to a certain confidence interval. In this case, we will use a 95% confidence interval, and the corresponding Z-star number is 2. When these numbers are all plugged in, we get the bottom equation and the calculated margin of error as plus or minus 3.1% at a confidence interval of 95%. A 95% confidence interval means that if this survey was done over and over again with different samples, 95% of the time, the statistics are going to land within the percentage range, which includes the margin of error. For example, that means that in 95% of the samples taken, the number of total Americans who feel that they are over their ideal weight is going to be 58 plus or minus 3.1%, or in other terms, from 54.9% to 61.1%. There are, of course, other errors called non-sampling errors in survey or poll taking, which are not factored into the margin of error. These non-sampling errors can include data entry errors, falsification of data when the information the participant gives is inaccurate, non-response when people refuse to participate or are not contacted for the opportunity, and more.